Have you ever wondered what happens when someone who has everything suddenly loses the one thing that makes them who they are? What if that someone was born into royalty, surrounded by luxury and privilege, yet found themselves facing a darkness so deep that even the brightest palace lights couldn't chase it away?
This is the story of Princess Charlotte, a young royal whose infectious smile could light up entire kingdoms, and whose laughter was said to bring hope to even the most troubled hearts. But what happens when that smile disappears overnight?
What happens when the very person meant to inspire joy in others can no longer find it within herself? Sometimes the most unexpected moments come from the most unlikely sources. Sometimes a simple question from someone you'd never expect can shatter everything you thought you knew about yourself. And sometimes, the truth hidden behind palace walls is far more complex than any fairy tale ever dared to tell. This is not just a story about royalty, this is a story about the human spirit, about finding light in the darkest places, and about how sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones who end up saving us. This is the story of how one guard's question changed everything, and how Princess Charlotte's journey from darkness back to light touched the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Are you ready to discover what really happened behind those palace gates? Are you ready to learn why Princess Charlotte's smile vanished and what it took to bring it back? Then let this story unfold, because what you're about to read will remind you that even in the grandest palaces, the most powerful moments often come from the simplest human connections. Princess Charlotte had always been different from other royals. While her cousins spent their days learning proper etiquette and practicing their curtsies, Charlotte could be found in the palace gardens talking to the gardeners about their flowers, or in the kitchens learning recipes from the cooks who had served her family for decades. Her parents, King William and Queen Catherine, had raised her to understand that being royal meant being connected to the people, not separated from them. The palace staff adored her. Unlike other young royals who barely acknowledged their presence, Charlotte knew everyone by name. She remembered birthdays, asked about family members, and always had time for a genuine conversation. The head butler, Thomas, often said that Princess Charlotte had a gift for making everyone feel important, regardless of their position in the palace hierarchy. Her smile was legendary throughout the kingdom. Newspapers often featured photographs of the young princess, her face bright with joy, her eyes sparkling with genuine warmth. Children across the nation drew pictures of her smile, and parents would tell their little ones stories about the princess who could make anyone happy just by being herself. Charlotte's public appearances were always the highlight of any royal event, not because of her status, but because of the pure joy she radiated. But behind that famous smile lived a young woman carrying burdens no one could see. Charlotte had always felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy crown. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every word analyzed, every gesture interpreted by media outlets hungry for stories. She couldn't have a bad day, couldn't show frustration, couldn't be anything less than perfect. The pressure was relentless and suffocating. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Charlotte had just returned from a particularly challenging royal tour, where she had visited hospitals, schools, and community centers across 3 different regions. For 2 weeks she had smiled for countless photographs, given dozens of speeches, and shaken thousands of hands. She had comforted crying children, celebrated with community leaders, and inspired hope in people facing difficult circumstances. Every moment had been scripted, every interaction carefully planned. That morning, as Charlotte sat in her private chambers looking out at the misty palace grounds, she felt something inside her simply stop working. It wasn't sadness exactly, or anger, or any emotion she could name. It was more like a switch had been turned off. The part of her that had always found joy in connecting with people, that had genuinely loved her royal duties, that had felt energized by helping others, that part had gone quiet. She tried to summon her usual enthusiasm as she prepared for the day's events. There was a charity luncheon to attend, followed by the opening of a new children's wing at the local hospital, and then a private dinner with foreign diplomats. Charlotte stood before her mirror, attempting to practice her smile, but what looked back at her felt foreign and false. The expression that had once come so naturally now required tremendous effort to maintain. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, noticed the change immediately but didn't comment. Margaret had served the royal family for over 20 years and had learned to read the subtle shifts in mood and energy that others might miss. She saw how Charlotte's shoulders seemed to carry extra weight, how her usual morning cheerfulness had been replaced by a quiet, distant politeness. The charity luncheon was the first public test of Charlotte's ability to maintain appearances. As she entered the grand ballroom filled with philanthropists, celebrities, and media representatives, Charlotte felt as though she were watching herself from outside her own body. She moved through the motions, greeting guests, posing for photographs, giving her prepared speech about the importance of supporting local charities.
But inside, she felt hollow. The guests didn't notice.
To them, Princess Charlotte appeared as radiant as ever. Her training in public appearances was so thorough, her natural grace so ingrained, that she could perform her royal duties even while feeling completely disconnected from them.
She smiled at the right moments, laughed at appropriate jokes, and asked thoughtful questions about the charitable work being discussed. But it all felt mechanical, like she was operating from a script written by someone else. After the luncheon, Charlotte had a brief break before her next engagement. She retreated to a small private room adjoining the main ballroom, hoping for a few moments to collect herself.
As she sat alone, staring at her hands folded in her lap, she realized that she couldn't remember the last time she had felt genuinely happy. The constant performance of happiness had somehow replaced the real thing, and now she wasn't sure if she even remembered what authentic joy felt like. The hospital visit that afternoon proved even more challenging. Charlotte had always found genuine fulfillment in her work with sick children, but now even that felt different. As she walked through the bright, cheerfully decorated corridors of the new children's wing, surrounded by doctors, hospital administrators, and photographers, she felt like she was watching a movie of someone else's life. She met with young patients, listened to their stories, and tried to offer comfort and encouragement. One little girl, barely 6 years old, and recovering from a serious surgery, looked up at Charlotte with such hope and admiration that it should have filled the princess's heart with warmth. Instead, Charlotte felt a strange numbness, as if there were a barrier between her and the emotions she knew she should be experiencing. The little girl handed Charlotte a drawing she had made, a picture of a princess with a big, bright smile surrounded by rainbows and flowers. "This is you," the child said proudly. "You make everyone happy." Charlotte accepted the drawing graciously, praised the little artist's talent, and promised to treasure the gift forever. But as she looked at the drawing, she felt a profound disconnect between the joyful princess depicted in the child's artwork and the empty feeling inside her own chest. The evening's diplomatic dinner was perhaps the most difficult challenge yet. Charlotte found herself seated between the ambassador from France and a trade representative from Japan, both of whom were eager to engage her in conversation about international relations, cultural exchanges, and economic partnerships. These were topics Charlotte had always found intellectually stimulating, and she was well prepared to discuss them knowledgeably. But tonight every word felt forced, every smile carefully constructed. As the evening wore on, Charlotte became increasingly aware of how much energy it was taking to maintain her facade. Every conversation required intense concentration to appear interested and engaged. Every laugh had to be consciously produced. Every expression of enthusiasm or concern had to be deliberately crafted. By the time the dinner concluded, Charlotte felt emotionally and physically exhausted in a way she had never experienced before. Later that night, alone in her chambers, Charlotte finally allowed herself to drop the mask she had been wearing all day. She sat at her dressing table, looking at herself in the mirror, and for the first time in her life she didn't recognize the person staring back at her. The face was the same features that had graced magazine covers and inspired countless admirers. But the light behind the eyes was gone. She thought about the little girl's drawing, still sitting on her bedside table where she had placed it upon returning to her rooms. The image of the smiling princess surrounded by joy and color seemed to mock her current state. How had she become so disconnected from the very quality that had defined her entire public identity? How had she lost the ability to feel the joy that she had always been so good at inspiring in others? Charlotte's mind wandered to her schedule for the coming weeks. There were dozens of engagements planned: charity events, school visits, cultural celebrations, international meetings. The thought of facing all of these obligations while feeling so empty inside was overwhelming. How long could she continue to perform happiness while feeling nothing but numbness? How long could she maintain the illusion that everything was fine? For the first time in her life, Princess Charlotte began to understand the true cost of living in the public eye. She had always known that her position came with sacrifices and responsibilities, but she had never realized how those demands could gradually erode the very essence of who she was as a person. The constant need to be on, to be inspiring and uplifting for others, had somehow drained her own reserves of genuine emotion. As she prepared for bed that night, Charlotte made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her. She decided that tomorrow,
She would try something different. She wouldn't schedule any public appearances. She wouldn't meet with advisors or attend meetings.
Instead, she would try to reconnect with herself, to find some trace of the authentic person beneath all the royal protocols and public expectations. But Charlotte had no idea that her journey back to herself would begin with the most unlikely source. A simple question from someone she had barely noticed before. Someone whose role in the palace was so humble that most royals wouldn't even acknowledge his presence. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places, and Princess Charlotte was about to discover that truth in the most surprising way possible. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Charlotte's internal weather perfectly. As she looked out at the rain-soaked palace gardens, she wondered if she would ever feel sunshine in her heart again. She had no way of knowing that the answer to that question was closer than she could possibly imagine, and that it would come from a conversation that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world.
The following morning, Charlotte woke feeling as though she were moving through thick fog. Every simple task, getting dressed, brushing her hair, choosing what to wear, seemed to require enormous effort. She had cleared her schedule, something she had never done before without being ill, and the unusual emptiness of her day felt both liberating and terrifying. Margaret knocked softly on her door, entering with the princess's usual morning tea and a concerned expression. "Your Highness, the Queen has asked if you're feeling well. She was surprised to hear about your cancelled engagements." Charlotte assured Margaret that she was fine, just needing a day to rest, but she could see in her lady-in-waiting's eyes that the explanation wasn't entirely convincing. Instead of staying in her rooms as she had initially planned, Charlotte found herself drawn to explore parts of the palace she rarely visited. She wandered through corridors lined with portraits of her ancestors, past rooms filled with priceless artwork and historical artifacts, through sections of the vast building that housed staff quarters and service areas. For the first time in years, she was walking through her home without a destination or purpose, and the freedom felt strange. As she walked, Charlotte began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way morning light filtered through stained glass windows, creating patterns on marble floors. The sound of her footsteps echoing in empty hallways. The distant conversations and laughter of staff members going about their daily work. It was as if she were seeing her own home through fresh eyes, like a visitor rather than someone who had lived there her entire life. Her aimless wandering eventually brought her to a part of the palace she had rarely explored, the East Wing, where many of the security offices and guard stations were located. This area was functional rather than decorative, with plain walls and practical furniture, a stark contrast to the opulent spaces where she typically spent her time. As she turned a corner, she nearly collided with someone carrying a stack of security reports. "Oh, forgive me, Your Highness," said a voice she didn't immediately recognize. Charlotte looked up to see a man in his 50s, wearing the uniform of the palace guard. He was of medium height with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed genuinely concerned about their minor collision. She realized she had never seen him before, despite the fact that he was clearly a long-term member of the palace staff. "No harm done," Charlotte replied automatically, then found herself pausing instead of continuing on her way. Something about this guard's demeanor was different from the usual formal interactions she had with staff members. He wasn't averting his eyes or stepping aside to let her pass. Instead, he was looking at her with what seemed like genuine human concern. "Are you lost, Your Highness?" he asked, and Charlotte was surprised by the directness of the question. Most staff members would never suggest that a royal family member might be anything other than exactly where they intended to be. "I suppose I am, in a way." Charlotte found herself answering honestly, which surprised her even more than his question had. The guard's name tag read James Morrison, and she estimated he had probably been working at the palace longer than she had been alive. James Morrison had indeed been at the palace for 27 years, though few people outside the security department knew his name. He had started as a junior guard fresh out of military service and had worked his way up to become one of the senior night shift supervisors. His job was to monitor the security systems, coordinate patrol schedules, and ensure that the royal family could sleep safely each night. It was important work, but it was largely invisible work, the kind that only gets noticed when something goes wrong. Over the years, James had observed the royal family from a distance. He had watched Prince William and Princess Catherine's children grow up, had seen their personalities develop, had witnessed their triumphs and challenges from his position in the background. He had always been particularly struck by Princess Charlotte's warmth and genuine interest in the people around her. Unlike some royals who seemed to look through the staff as if they were invisible, Charlotte had always acknowledged the guards with a smile and a nod when their paths crossed. But today, something was different. James had developed a keen eye for reading people during his years in security work. and he could see that Princess Charlotte was struggling with something. There was a heaviness in her posture, a distance in her eyes that he had never seen before.
Her usual bright energy was absent, replaced by what looked like confusion and sadness. "Would you like me to escort you back to the main palace?" James asked gently.
These corridors can be a bit confusing if you're not familiar with them. Charlotte considered the offer, then surprised herself by saying, "Actually, would you mind if I asked you something? I promise I'm not lost in the building. I know my way around, but I am feeling rather lost in general, if that makes any sense." James was taken aback by the princess's openness. In all his years of service, he had never had a royal family member speak to him so candidly about their personal feelings. "Of course, Your Highness. Though I'm not sure what advice a security guard could offer that would be useful to someone in your position."
Maybe that's exactly why I need to ask you, Charlotte replied. Everyone else in my life has expectations about what I should think or feel or do.
"You're probably the only person in this palace who doesn't have an agenda when it comes to my happiness." James gestured toward a small break room nearby. "Would you like to sit down? I was just finishing my shift and there's fresh coffee if you'd like some." Charlotte nodded, and they settled into simple wooden chairs around a table that had probably seen thousands of quiet conversations between guards over the years. "I've been watching you grow up from a distance, Your Highness," James began carefully. "And if you don't mind me saying, you've always seemed like someone who genuinely cared about people. That's not as common as you might think, even among good people." Charlotte wrapped her hands around the warm coffee mug James had given her, finding comfort in its simple warmth. "I used to care," she said quietly. "I used to feel real joy when I met people, when I could help with charitable work, when I could make someone smile. But lately, it all feels like I'm just going through the motions."
"Like I'm performing happiness instead of feeling it." James nodded thoughtfully.
"That sounds exhausting," he said simply, and Charlotte felt a rush of relief at being understood so immediately. "It is exhausting," she agreed.
And I feel guilty for saying that because I know how privileged my life is. I have opportunities to help people, to make a difference, to live comfortably. What right do I have to complain?" "Your Highness, if I may," James said, leaning forward slightly, "I think you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether you have the right to feel unhappy. The question is, what happens to all those people who depend on your joy and inspiration when you don't have any left to give?" Charlotte looked up sharply, struck by the unexpected wisdom in his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you can't pour from an empty cup," James continued.
"I've watched you over the years, and your gift isn't just that you care about people. Your gift is that you have enough genuine joy inside yourself to share it with others. But if you keep giving away pieces of yourself without taking time to refill your own cup, eventually there won't be anything left to share." Charlotte felt tears forming in her eyes for the first time in weeks. "But how do I refill it? How do I find that joy again when everything I used to love about my role now feels like an obligation?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Your Highness, may I tell you something I observed about you that you might not realize about yourself?" Charlotte nodded, curious about this guard's perspective on her life. "The times I've seen you look most genuinely happy weren't during the big public events or official ceremonies," James said. "They were during the small, unplanned moments. Like when you stopped to help one of the kitchen staff who had dropped a tray of dishes, or when you spent an hour talking to old Mrs. Henderson from the cleaning staff about her grandchildren, or when you sat on the floor of the children's ward last Christmas. Not for the cameras, but just because you wanted to be at the same level as the kids you were talking to." Charlotte listened intently, surprised by how closely this guard had observed her behavior over the years. "Those weren't scheduled moments," James continued. "Those weren't part of your official duties. Those were times when you were just being yourself, connecting with people as a human being rather than as a princess. And that's when your smile was most real."
"But how can I do more of that when my entire life is scheduled and scripted?" Charlotte asked. "Every moment of my day is planned by other people." "Maybe the question isn't how to change your entire life," James suggested.
"Maybe it's how to find those authentic moments within the structure you already have. Maybe it's about remembering that you're a person first and a princess second, and giving that person permission to exist even within your royal duties." Charlotte sat quietly, processing James's words. She had never thought about her situation in quite those terms before. She had been so focused on feeling trapped by her role that she hadn't considered how she might reclaim her authentic self within it. "James," she said finally, "can I ask you something else?"
How do you stay connected to yourself in a job where you have to follow protocols and procedures all the time? How do you maintain your humanity in such a structured environment? James smiled for the first time during their conversation. That's an interesting question, Your Highness. I suppose the answer is that I try to remember why I do this work. I'm not just following security protocols for the sake of following rules. I'm protecting people I care about. Every night when I check those monitors and coordinate those patrols, I'm thinking about keeping your family safe so you can do the good work you do in the world.
You think about us as people, not just as your job. Charlotte realized.
Exactly. And maybe you could think about the people you meet and help, not just as your royal duties, but as opportunities to connect with other human beings who need what you have to offer. Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest. Not the full return of her joy, but perhaps the first glimmer of hope that it might be possible to find her way back to herself. James, this conversation has been more helpful than months of official meetings and royal counseling.
How is it that a security guard understands what I'm going through better than trained advisors? Maybe because I see you as a person who happens to be a princess, rather than a princess who happens to be a person, James replied.
And maybe because sometimes the best perspective comes from someone who's watching from the outside instead of someone who's caught up in the same system that's causing the problem. As their conversation continued, Charlotte began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of being truly seen and understood for who she was, beneath all the titles and expectations. This chance encounter with a guard she had never really noticed before was turning into exactly what she hadn't known she needed: an honest conversation with someone who had no agenda other than genuine human concern. But their talk was far from over, and James had more observations to share that would completely change how Charlotte viewed herself and her role. The most important part of their conversation was yet to come, and it would involve a question that would shake Charlotte to her core, while simultaneously offering her a path back to the joy she thought she had lost forever. As their conversation deepened, Charlotte found herself sharing things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. She told James about the pressure of always having to be perfect, about the weight of knowing that millions of people looked to her for inspiration, about the fear that she was failing everyone who believed in her. James listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking thoughtful questions, but never trying to fix her or offer simple solutions. Your Highness, James said after Charlotte had been talking for nearly an hour, may I share something I've learned during my years of service here? Charlotte nodded, having come to value his perspective more than she could have imagined when their conversation began. I've had the privilege of observing your family during some of their most private moments, not because I was intruding, but because security work sometimes puts you in position to witness things others don't see. I've watched your parents navigate difficulties. I've seen them struggle with the same kinds of pressures you're describing now. Charlotte leaned forward, intrigued. She had always seen her parents as perfectly suited to royal life, never seeming to struggle with the demands that felt so overwhelming to her. What I've learned, James continued, is that the members of your family who seem most at peace with their roles are the ones who have found ways to stay connected to their core values and to the people they truly are, even within all the protocols and expectations. But how do they do that? Charlotte asked. Sometimes I feel like I don't even remember who I really am underneath all the training and expectations. James was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte could see that he was considering his words very carefully. Finally, he looked directly at her and asked a question that would change everything. Your Highness, if you could wake up tomorrow and no one in the world knew you were a princess, if you were just Charlotte, a regular person with complete freedom to choose how to spend your time and energy, what would you do? What would bring you joy? The question hit Charlotte like a physical force. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing she had no immediate answer. The question was so simple, yet she found herself completely unable to answer it. When was the last time she had thought about what she wanted, independent of what was expected of her?
Charlotte started, then stopped. I don't know.
I honestly don't know what would make me happy if I didn't have to consider whether it was appropriate for a princess or whether it served the crown or whether it would be good for my public image.
That's exactly the problem, James said gently.
You've spent so much time being what everyone else needs you to be that you've lost touch with who you actually are. And that's why everything feels empty now.
You're trying to give people something authentic, but you can't give what you don't have. Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face. But for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding what had been happening to her. So how do I find my way back? She whispered.
You start small,
James replied.
You start by paying attention to moments when you feel even a tiny spark of genuine interest or joy, no matter how insignificant they might seem.
And then you follow those sparks, even if they lead you somewhere unexpected. Can you give me an example? James smiled. Well, what made you decide to wander into this part of the palace today? What drew you here? Charlotte considered the question.
I suppose I wanted to see parts of my home that I'd never really explored. I was curious about how other people live and work here. Curiosity, James said.
That's something authentic right there. You were curious, so you explored. That's a piece of who you really are, someone who's genuinely interested in other people's lives and experiences. Charlotte felt a small flutter of recognition.
I do love learning about people's stories, she admitted. Even during official events, the parts I enjoy most are the conversations where someone tells me something real about their life.
So maybe James suggested instead of thinking about your royal duties as performances you have to give, you could think of them as opportunities to satisfy your genuine curiosity about people. Instead of trying to be inspiring for its own sake, you could focus on learning something real about each person you meet.
Charlotte felt something clicking into place in her mind. So instead of trying to perform being interested, I could actually be interested. Exactly.
And I think you'll find that when you're genuinely curious about someone, your natural warmth and care will come through automatically. You won't have to manufacture it.
They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Charlotte processing this new way of thinking about her role. Finally, she asked, James, how is it that you understand this so clearly?
Have you struggled with something similar? James chuckled softly. Your Highness, I think most people struggle with staying authentic while meeting other people's expectations. It's just that most of us don't have to do it quite so publicly, but I've learned that the key is to find the overlap between what the world needs from you and what genuinely matters to you personally.
What do you mean?
Well, the world needs you to be a symbol of hope and compassion and service to others. But you personally, from what I can observe, genuinely care about helping people and making connections.
So the trick isn't to choose between being authentic and fulfilling your role. The trick is to find the authentic parts of yourself that naturally align with what your role requires.
Charlotte felt a surge of hope, unlike anything she had experienced in months. You're saying I don't have to choose between being myself and being a good princess. I'm saying that maybe being your truest self is exactly what will make you the best princess you can be. As their conversation continued, Charlotte began to make plans for how she might approach her upcoming engagements differently. Instead of dreading the charity luncheon scheduled for the following week, she found herself curious about the stories of the people she would meet there. Instead of viewing the hospital visits as performances to get through, she began thinking about the genuine connections she might make with patients and families.
James, Charlotte said eventually, I need to ask you something important. This conversation has been more valuable to me than I can express, but I'm curious. Why did you take the time to really talk with me today?
You could have just given directions back to the main palace and gone about your work. James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Your Highness, I've been watching your family for many years, and I've seen how much good you do in the world. When I saw you today looking so lost and sad, I thought about all the people who depend on your light and inspiration. I thought about what would happen if that light went out permanently. And I realized that sometimes the people who give the most to others are the ones who most need someone to give back to them. Today, you needed someone to see you as a person rather than as a role. I was honored to be that person. Charlotte felt overwhelmed by gratitude. James, I want you to know that this conversation has changed something fundamental for me. I feel like I've been lost in a fog for months, and you've helped me find a path back to myself.
I'm glad, Your Highness.
But remember, the real work starts now. It's one thing to understand these ideas intellectually.
It's another thing to put them into practice when you're facing real pressures and expectations.
Do you think I can do it?
Do you think I can find my way back to genuine joy while still fulfilling my responsibilities? James smiled, and Charlotte could see genuine confidence in his expression. Your Highness, I've watched you for years. You have something special, a real gift for connecting with people and bringing light into their lives. That gift didn't disappear. It just got buried under expectations and pressure. Now that you understand what happened, I believe you can uncover it again. As Charlotte prepared to leave and return to her chambers, she felt like a different person than the one who had wandered into this corridor hours earlier. The emptiness hadn't completely disappeared, but it had been replaced by something precious: hope and a clear sense of direction. "James," she said as they stood to part ways, "would it be appropriate for me to ask you to check in with me occasionally? Not in any official capacity, but just as someone who helped me understand something important about myself."
It would be my honor, Your Highness. Over the following weeks, Charlotte began implementing the insights from her conversation with James.
She approached her royal duties with renewed curiosity about the people she met. Instead of trying to perform inspiration, she focused on learning something genuine about each person's story. She found that when she was truly interested in others, her natural warmth and joy began to return automatically. The change was gradual but unmistakable. Staff members noticed that Princess Charlotte seemed more relaxed and present during engagements. The media commented on a new depth and authenticity in her public appearances. Children at the hospitals she visited seemed to respond to something different in her energy. She was still the same person who had always cared about others, but now the care was flowing from an authentic place rather than from a sense of obligation. Most importantly, Charlotte's smile returned. Not the practiced, perfect smile of her earlier royal training, but something deeper and more genuine. It was a smile that came from someone who had found her way back to herself and discovered that her truest self was exactly what the world needed from her. 6 months later, Charlotte would often think about that chance encounter with James Morrison in the palace corridor. She realized that sometimes the most profound help comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the questions that change our lives often come from people we might otherwise overlook. James had seen her not as a princess who needed to maintain an image, but as a human being who had lost her way and needed someone to help her find it again. The little girl's drawing still sat on Charlotte's bedside table. But now when she looked at it, she saw not a mockery of what she had lost, but a reminder of what she had found again. The smiling princess surrounded by rainbows and joy wasn't just a fantasy created by a child's imagination. It was a reflection of who Charlotte truly was when she allowed herself to be authentic, curious, and genuinely connected to the people around her. And whenever she felt the old pressures and expectations threatening to overwhelm her again, Charlotte would remember James's simple but powerful question: "What would bring you joy?" The answer, she had learned, was always the same: connecting with people as her genuine self, following her curiosity, and allowing her natural compassion to flow freely.
These were not separate from her royal duties. They were the very heart of what made her royal duties meaningful.
Princess Charlotte's smile had not just returned, it had evolved into something deeper and more sustainable than it had ever been before. And it all began with a guard's simple question that shocked everyone who heard the story, especially Charlotte herself. Princess Charlotte's smile vanished. The guard's question shocked everyone. Emotional story.